My name is Genevieve, 33 years old, and 3 hours after I buried my father, my stepmother publicly handed me the bill for his casket. I paid it without blinking. But as I walked to my car, his hospice nurse slipped a rusty key into my pocket and whispered a secret that made my blood run cold. Before I tell you what I found inside the abandoned house at the edge of town, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. The air inside the Oakwood Country Club was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and cheap sympathy. It had been exactly 3 hours since we lowered my father Winston into the cold Chicago ground. The funeral itself had been a masterpiece of theatrical grief, directed entirely by my 55-year-old stepmother Beatrice. At the cemetery, she had wept loudly, clutching the arm of her 30-year-old son Preston while leaning heavily against the mahogany casket. But here at the reception, surrounded by the city's most affluent business owners and socialites, her tears had miraculously evaporated. I stood near the back of the banquet hall, holding a glass of sparkling water, wearing a modest, sensible black suit. I preferred to remain in the shadows observing. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was built on watching details that other people ignored. I tracked missing funds, uncovered hidden assets, and exposed corporate fraud for a living. I dealt with numbers because numbers, unlike people, never lied. My father had built a massive logistics empire from the ground up, and for years Beatrice had slowly and systematically driven a wedge between us. She convinced him that my analytical mind was cold, that my independence was a sign of disrespect, and that her son Preston was the true heir to the family legacy. The low hum of conversation in the room suddenly quieted as Beatrice picked up a silver spoon and clinked it against her crystal champagne flute. She stood at the center of the room, draped in a custom morning dress that cost more than most people earned in a month. Preston stood right beside her, wearing a tailored Italian suit, looking more like he was hosting a victory party than mourning the man who had raised him. "Thank you all for coming today to honor my wonderful husband," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying effortlessly across the banquet hall. Winston was a titan of industry, a loving partner, and a generous provider. He gave everything to this family. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room before landing directly on me. "And speaking of giving, I think it is only fair that those who took so much from him finally show some gratitude." The crowd parted slightly, leaving me exposed. Beatrice walked toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She stopped 2 feet away and held out a thick leather billfold. "This is the invoice for your father's funeral arrangements," she said, her voice loud enough for every wealthy guest to hear. "The casket, the floral displays, the burial plot, and this reception. It comes to exactly $45,000. Since you have spent your entire adult life acting like you are better than this family, hiding behind your computer screens as a glorified calculator. Preston and I decided this is your opportunity to finally contribute. You alienated him, Genevieve. Paying this bill is the least you can do to clear your conscience." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. I could feel the eyes of dozens of guests burning into me. They were waiting for me to break, to cry, to run out of the room in humiliation. Beatrice stood there with a smug, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She wanted to establish dominance. She wanted to prove to all of Winston's wealthy associates that I was nothing more than a pathetic, estranged daughter who owed them everything. Before I could even reach for the billfold, Preston stepped forward. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust, taking in my unbranded black suit. "Come on, Mom, do not embarrass her," Preston chimed in, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Look at her. She probably maxed out her credit cards just to buy that sad little suit. She cannot afford $45,000. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it carelessly. It fluttered through the air and landed right at my feet. "There you go, Genevieve. That is for the Uber back to your sad little studio apartment. Oh, and do not bother coming by the family mansion to collect your things. Your access codes have been deleted, and the guards have instructions to call the police if you trespass." The cruelty was so calculated, so perfectly orchestrated, that I actually felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. They thought I was a struggling accountant, drowning in student debt. They had no idea that for the past 10 years, I had been running independent forensic audits for international conglomerates. I did not just crunch numbers, I recovered stolen fortunes. My net worth was a secret I kept closely guarded, mostly to protect myself from people exactly like Beatrice and Preston. I did not look at the $100 bill on the floor. I looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. I reached out and took the leather billfold from her hand. I opened it, glancing briefly at the itemized list of expenses. "You are right, Beatrice," I said, my voice steady and perfectly calm. "Father did give everything to this family. It is a shame you spent his final days worrying about floral arrangements instead of his comfort." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a solid metal invitation-only black card, the kind of card that required a minimum 8-figure balance just to hold. The smug smile on Preston's face faltered slightly as he recognized the heavy matte finish of the card. I signaled for the country club manager, who had been hovering nervously near the catering tables. "Charge the entire amount to this account," I told the manager, handing him the black card and the invoice. "And keep the tab open for the rest of the evening. Let my stepmother and stepbrother drink as much champagne as they need to soothe their terrible grief." The manager nodded quickly, his eyes wide as he hurried away to process the payment. Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. I did not give her the satisfaction of another word. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, my head held high, leaving them to deal with the confused whispers of their wealthy audience. The crisp Chicago air hit my face as I stepped out into the parking lot. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the rows of luxury vehicles. I was walking toward my car, finally allowing the adrenaline to leave my body, when someone intentionally bumped hard into my shoulder. I stumbled slightly, turning around to see Clara, the private hospice nurse Beatrice had hired for my father's final weeks. Clara was a quiet, unassuming woman who usually kept her head down. I expected an apology, but Clara did not say a word. Instead, she quickly grabbed my hand and shoved something cold and hard into my palm. Before I could ask what she was doing, she leaned in close. The smell of medical antiseptic and peppermint soap radiated from her uniform. "Follow me," Clara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "He is waiting for you inside the old Miller property." She immediately pulled away and hurried toward her own car without looking back. I stood frozen in the parking lot, my heart pounding against my ribs. I opened my hand. Resting in my palm was a heavy, rusty brass key. The old Miller property was an abandoned farmhouse on the desolate outskirts of the city, sitting on a massive plot of undeveloped land my father had purchased decades ago. It had been sitting empty for years, surrounded by overgrown weeds and chain-link fences. Why would Clara want me to go there? And more importantly, who was waiting for me? My analytical mind raced through the possibilities, but my intuition told me I could not ignore this. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of the country club. I headed away from the wealthy suburbs and drove toward the forgotten industrial edges of Chicago. The drive took 45 minutes, the scenery shifting from manicured lawns to cracked pavement and rusted streetlights. When I finally pulled up to the old Miller property, the sun had completely disappeared. The farmhouse looked like a ghost in the dark, its windows boarded up from the inside. I parked my car behind a cluster of overgrown oak trees to keep it out of sight. I gripped the rusty key tightly, stepped onto the rotting wooden porch, and slid the key into the deadbolt. It turned with a heavy clank. I pushed the door open, stepping into a hallway that smelled of dust and old wood. The windows were heavily blacked out, but a faint, warm glow spilled out from the living room at the end of the hall. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. When I turned the corner into the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. I stopped breathing entirely. The room was not empty. A portable medical generator hummed quietly in the corner. An IV stand was positioned next to a worn velvet armchair. And sitting in that armchair, connected to a clear tube feeding fluids into his arm, was my father, Winston. He was pale, his face gaunt and covered in a silvery stubble, but he was breathing. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, met mine as I stood paralyzed in the doorway. "Dad," I choked out the word tearing out of my throat. My knees gave out and I rushed forward, falling to the floor beside his chair. I reached out my hands, shaking violently, and touched his arm. He was warm. He was real. But I just watched them lower your casket into the ground. I paid the bill for your funeral. Winston offered a weak, tired smile and placed his hand over mine. It is good to see you, Genevieve. I am sorry I had to put you through that today. I could not process the reality of the situation. I looked around the room, noticing a folding table covered with medical supplies, heart monitors, and prescription bottles. What is happening? I pleaded, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. How are you here? Winston let out a ragged breath and leaned back against the chair. He looked at me, and the warmth in his eyes was slowly replaced by a cold, hardened determination. They did not break my heart, Genevieve, he said, his voice raspy but steady. They poisoned it, Beatrice and Preston. For the last 6 months, they have been microdosing my morning coffee with a highly concentrated traceless digitalis compound. They were slowly inducing cardiac arrest to make it look like a natural heart attack, so they could seize the logistics company without raising any suspicion. The words hit me like physical blows. Digitalis, a medication used to treat heart conditions, but in the wrong doses, a lethal, undetectable poison that causes complete heart failure. My mind immediately went to all the times Beatrice insisted on preparing his coffee herself, playing the role of the devoted, caring wife. I realized what they were doing too late, Winston continued. The poison had already damaged the tissue. I knew if I stayed in that mansion, they would eventually give me the final fatal dose. I had to get out, but if I simply left, they would use the corporate bylaws to declare me mentally unfit and seize my assets anyway. I needed them to think they won. He pointed to the medical equipment. Clara figured it out. She recognized the symptoms. She helped me secure a cardiac suppression drug that temporarily slowed my heart rate to practically zero. We timed it perfectly. When I collapsed, Clara was the one who pronounced me. We paid off the right people at the private morgue to ensure a closed casket. The box you buried today was filled with sandbags. I sat back on my heels, wiping the tears from my face as my shock morphed into a burning, white-hot rage. My father had been forced to fake his own death just to survive the people living under his own roof. Beatrice and Preston had murdered him in cold blood, or at least they thought they had, all for money and power. They took my company, sweetheart, Winston said quietly, squeezing my hand. They think they got away with the perfect crime. They think they erased me, and they think they can erase you. But they made one massive miscalculation. He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small encrypted black flash drive. He held it out to me. They do not know my daughter is the sharpest forensic auditor in the state, Winston said, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute clarity. This drive contains the backdoor access codes to the family firm's main servers. It has every hidden ledger, every secure firewall entry point. I took the flash drive, the cold metal grounding me to the reality of what we had to do. I had spent my life playing by the rules, keeping my head down, and letting Beatrice and Preston control the narrative. But this was no longer about family politics or petty insults at a country club. This was attempted murder. I want you to track every penny, Winston whispered, leaning forward. I want you to find exactly what Preston is hiding in those corporate accounts. We are not just going to take the company back, Genevieve. We are going to destroy them. I looked at my father, then at the encrypted flash drive resting in my palm. The scared, isolated daughter who had paid for a fake funeral an hour ago was gone completely. In her place stood a woman ready to dismantle an empire brick by brick. I nodded, slipping the drive safely into the pocket of my black suit. Consider it done, Dad, I said, my voice cold and unwavering. They wanted to bury you, but they are the ones who are going to need a casket. By the next morning, the rotting farmhouse on the edge of the city had been completely transformed, while Dr. Linus and Clara monitored my father's fragile vital signs. I went to work doing what I did best. I drove to an electronics supply distributor downtown and used my black card to purchase $50,000 worth of high-grade server racks, signal scramblers, and military-level encryption routers. If Beatrice and Preston thought I was just a sad girl with a calculator, they were about to receive a very expensive education. I spent 12 straight hours wiring the equipment through the old walls, setting up a secure, untraceable digital command center right in the middle of the dusty living room. My father slept for most of the day, his body fighting to flush the digitalis poison from his system. Every time the heart monitor beeped a steady rhythm, I felt a surge of cold motivation. I plugged the black flash drive he had given me into my newly secured terminal. The drive contained the legacy backdoor access codes to the logistics company just as he promised. But when I ran the primary decryption sequence, a blaring red access denied warning flashed across my screen. I typed a few rapid commands to trace the block. Preston had not wasted a single second. The moment my father was pronounced dead, Preston had authorized an emergency IT overhaul, replacing the legacy firewalls with a synchronized biometric two-factor authentication system. The backdoor codes were still valid, but to bypass the new security protocols without triggering a massive alarm, I needed a localized digital fingerprint. I needed a direct, physical clone of Preston's personal laptop hard drive. Getting close to Preston's laptop seemed impossible, considering they had revoked my security access to the family mansion just yesterday. But arrogant people are predictable. They love an audience, and Beatrice was no exception. 3 days after the funeral, Beatrice hosted what she called a morning brunch at the mansion. It was a grotesque display of wealth, masquerading as grief. She had invited dozens of high society wives, local politicians, and country club executives to eat imported caviar and drink mimosas in my father's home. I knew Preston would be there shaking hands and playing the role of the capable new leader. I also knew he rarely brought his personal laptop downstairs during social events. I arrived at the front gates of the mansion at exactly 11 in the morning. The private security guards hesitated when they saw my car, but I calmly informed them I was only there to collect my childhood photo albums from the attic and would leave immediately. Because several prominent guests were lingering near the driveway, the guards waved me through to avoid a public scene. I walked through the massive double doors of the estate I grew up in. The foyer smelled of fresh lilies and expensive perfume. In the formal dining room, Beatrice was holding court at the head of a long table. She wore a tailored black silk dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a morning event. I paused behind a marble pillar, staying out of sight, as her sharp voice carried easily over the clinking of crystal glasses. "It has just been exhausting, taking on the burden of this family." Beatrice sighed dramatically, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. When I met Winston, he was completely broken by that miserable first marriage. His first wife had no ambition, no vision. I had to build him up into the titan he became. I rescued him, really. A chorus of sympathetic murmurs rose from the wealthy women seated around her. "And now I have to deal with his daughter." Beatrice continued, her tone dripping with manufactured pity. "Genevieve is a sweet girl, I suppose, but completely devoid of any social grace. She has absolutely no business sense. She spent her entire life hiding behind spreadsheets. It is a profound blessing that my Preston is here to carry the corporate torch. I honestly do not know what the company would do without his leadership. Genevieve would run it into the ground in a week." My jaw tightened, but I did not let the anger break my focus. This was exactly how it had been for the 15 years since Beatrice married my father. She systematically painted my mother as a failure, and me as an awkward, useless burden, all while positioning her own son as the golden savior. Let her talk. Let her believe her own lies. I slipped away from the pillar and moved silently up the grand staircase. The second floor was deserted, all the staff occupied with the brunch downstairs. I walked past the master suite and headed straight for the south wing, where Preston kept his home office. The door was unlocked. Arrogance meant he never thought anyone would dare enter his space. I slipped inside and closed the solid oak door behind me. The office was a monument to Preston's inflated ego. Golf trophies he had bought rather than won lined the shelves, and a massive oil painting of himself hung behind the desk. But right in the center of the mahogany desk sat my prize, his sleek silver laptop. I pulled a specialized hardware cloning device from my purse. It was a small black box, no larger than a deck of cards, designed for rapid data extraction by forensic investigators. I plugged the connecting cable into the laptop's data port and tapped a sequence into the device's screen. A green progress bar appeared, illuminating the dark office with a faint glow. The process would take exactly 4 minutes. I stood frozen by the desk, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifting up from the dining room below. My heart hammered against my ribs. 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. The progress bar hit 100%, and a soft chime indicated the clone was complete. I quickly unplugged the device, slipped it back into my purse, and made sure the laptop was positioned exactly as I had found it. I opened the office door and stepped out into the hallway, pulling my posture down into the meek, defeated stance they expected from me. I took 2 steps toward the stairs before a heavy hand clamped down violently onto my shoulder, spinning me around. Preston stood there, his face flushed, his grip painfully tight on my arm. He smelled like expensive scotch and aggressive cologne. "What the hell are you doing up here?" Genevieve Preston demanded, his voice a low, threatening hiss. "I thought my mother told you to get your sad little boxes from the attic and get out." I winced, intentionally playing the part of the intimidated sister. "Let go of me, Preston. I just got lost looking for the attic stairs. I am leaving right now." He did not let go. His fingers dug deeper into my bicep, pushing me back until my shoulders hit the hallway wall. He leaned in close, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "You do not get to wander around this house anymore," he sneered. "You do not belong here. I am the CEO now. I run the company, I own the estate, and you are permanently cut off from every single dime of the family wealth." I lowered my eyes, forcing a tremor into my voice. "You cannot just take everything. Dad would not have wanted this." Preston laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the empty corridor. "Dad is dead in the ground, Genevieve. What he wanted does not matter anymore. And as for his precious company, you think I actually want to run that boring logistics dinosaur? I am moving on to bigger things." He leaned closer, completely unable to resist the urge to brag. His ego needed me to know how badly I had lost. "I have already signed a preliminary agreement this morning," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with greed. "I am liquidating Winston's entire legacy. A commercial conglomerate is buying the firm, the warehouses, the fleet, everything. $200 million in cold hard cash. I am going to tear down everything your father built, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me. Now get out of my house before I have security drag you out by your hair." He shoved me away, releasing my arms so forcefully I stumbled forward. I kept my head down, letting my shoulders shake as if I were crying from the humiliation. I hurried down the stairs, practically running out the front doors and past the security guards without saying a word. I kept up the act until I was safely inside my car and driving down the private road. Once I was a mile away from the mansion, I wiped the fake tears from my eyes and pulled over to the side of the road. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small black cloning device. Preston thought he had just won the ultimate victory. He thought he had intimidated a helpless, grieving daughter into submission. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his complete destruction. I put the car in drive and sped back towards the abandoned farmhouse. It was time to see exactly what the new CEO was hiding on his hard drive. I pulled my car behind the overgrown oak trees at the abandoned farmhouse and hurried inside. The heavy wooden door shut behind me, sealing me inside the makeshift fortress I had built. In the living room, the portable generator continued its steady hum. My father was asleep in the velvet armchair, his breathing slow but even. Dr. Linus had left a note on the monitoring table stating Winston's vitals were stabilizing, but he needed uninterrupted rest. I did not wake him. I walked straight to my digital command center, pulled the black cloning device from my purse, and connected it to the primary server rack. The heavy monitors flickered to life. I initiated the decryption sequence. Preston was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He had encrypted his personal hard drive with a standard corporate security key. It would have kept out a casual snooper. It took my software exactly 11 seconds to shatter it. Lines of data cascaded across my screens as Preston's entire digital life lay bare before me. I bypassed his personal folders and went straight for the hidden corporate ledgers. The backdoor access codes my father had given me merged flawlessly with the digital footprint I had just stolen from Preston's computer. The biometric two-factor authentication system recognized the clone as the CEO's authorized device. I was in. I had complete unrestricted access to the family logistics empire. I started pulling the financial records from the last 6 months, right around the time Beatrice began serving my father his poisoned coffee. At first glance, the company's books looked pristine. The profit margins were steady, the payroll was balanced, and the quarterly projections aligned perfectly with industry standards. But I was a forensic accountant. I did not look at what was on the page. I looked for what was missing. I ran a deep algorithmic sweep cross-referencing the company's international shipping manifests with their offshore vendor payments. Within 20 minutes, the first red flag appeared. A shell company registered in the Cayman Islands was billing our firm for maritime freight consulting. The invoices were massive, authorized directly by Preston and completely fabricated. The logistics company had not used maritime freight consultants in a decade. I followed the digital money trail. One shell company led to another, which fed into a blind trust, which funneled directly into a series of untraceable crypto wallets. I sat back in my chair staring at the final tally glowing on my monitor. Preston had not embezzled a few $1,000s to fund a lavish lifestyle. He had methodically drained $40 million in liquid company assets over a span of 5 months. My hands flew across the keyboard as I dug deeper into his deleted communications folder. I needed to know where $40 million had disappeared to so quickly. I recovered a cache of encrypted text messages and heavily redacted emails sent from a burner account. Reading through the transcripts, the reality of Preston's desperation became crystal clear. Preston was a compulsive gambler, but he did not play at normal casinos. He had gotten himself involved with a highly illegal international underground betting syndicate. The messages detailed catastrophic losses on offshore sports betting and high-stakes private poker games. Preston had leveraged his new position at the company to borrow money from the syndicate, fully expecting to win it back. Instead, he lost everything. The most recent messages from the syndicate were terrifying. They were not polite collection notices. They included photos of Preston's car, the front gates of the family mansion, and detailed schedules of his daily movements. The syndicate had given him an ultimatum. He had to repay the $40 million by the end of the month, or they were going to kill him. This was the real reason Preston was rushing to liquidate my father's legacy company to a commercial conglomerate for $200 million. He did not care about business strategy or corporate expansion. He was selling out the entire family empire at a massive discount just to save his own life from a ruthless criminal cartel. A dry, raspy cough broke my concentration. I turned around to see my father awake. He was sitting up slightly in his armchair, watching me with tired but alert eyes. "Did you get in?" Winston asked, his voice weak but laced with anticipation. I grabbed my tablet, synced it to the main server, and walked over to his chair. I knelt beside him and placed the tablet in his lap. "I got everything, Dad. But it is much worse than we thought. Beatrice and Preston did not just want to steal your company, Preston bankrupted it." I scrolled through the financial documents showing my father the fake invoices, the shell companies, and the final $40 million deficit. I watched as Winston absorbed the information. Decades of his sweat, his late nights, and his relentless hard work had been funneled into the hands of a criminal syndicate by an arrogant boy he had raised as his own son. I expected my father to look devastated. Instead, his jaw set into a rigid line. The betrayal fueled a profound, calculating anger. "He is selling the firm to a conglomerate for $200 million to cover this debt," Winston stated, processing the strategy instantly. "The conglomerate buyers will demand a clean audit before they finalize the acquisition. Preston is trying to close the deal before they realize $40 million is missing from the operational budget." "Exactly," I said. "But that is not all. Preston's gambling debts explain why he needed the company liquidated so fast. It does not entirely explain why Beatrice was so eager to poison you. She could have simply divorced you and taken half your assets in a settlement without risking a murder charge. There has to be something else. Something she wanted all for herself." I walked back to my server terminal. I began searching Preston's personal hard drive for any documents related to Beatrice. I bypassed his work files and cracked open a heavily password-protected folder labeled Estate Planning. Inside were hundreds of legal documents, bank statements, and property deeds. I sorted them by date, focusing on the weeks immediately preceding my father's supposed death. A single PDF document caught my eye. It was an insurance contract underwritten by a premium global firm. I opened the file and felt the breath leave my lungs. "Dad," I called out, my voice tight. "You need to hear this." I read the document aloud. It was a newly drafted supplemental life insurance policy taken out on my father's life just 4 months ago. The premium payments were astronomically high, paid directly from Beatrice's private account. The total payout value upon Winston's death was a staggering $50 million. And Beatrice was listed as the sole uncontested beneficiary. "She wanted it all," Winston murmured from his chair, his voice dripping with disgust. "Half my assets in a divorce was not enough. She wanted the entire estate, and she wanted a $50 million tax-free payday on top of it." "But there is a catch," I said, highlighting a specific clause buried deep within the legal jargon of the policy. "The insurance company requires a massive burden of proof for a payout this large. Because you supposedly died of a sudden, unexpected heart attack at home, the policy mandates a comprehensive independent post-mortem toxicology report before they release a single dime." Winston frowned, shifting his weight in the armchair. "If they run a real toxicology screen on those blood samples taken at the morgue, the coroner will find the massive levels of digitalis in my system. The insurance company will immediately flag it as a homicide. Beatrice will not get $50 million. She will get a life sentence in federal prison." She knows that, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I initiated a dark web search protocol. "Beatrice is cunning. If she knew about the toxicology requirement, she already has a plan to bypass it." I ran a deep scan on Beatrice's private email servers, bouncing my signal through 3 different proxy locations to remain invisible. I specifically targeted encrypted messages sent within the last 48 hours. My decryption software locked onto a heavily shielded communication chain taking place over a dark web messaging client. The emails were between Beatrice and a man using a numerical alias. I ran a quick cross-reference on the alias and identified him as a disgraced, struck-off former medical examiner who now operated a black market laboratory in the city. I opened the intercepted messages. The contents were chilling in their clinical, business-like tone. Beatrice was actively negotiating a massive cash bribe. She was paying the corrupt examiner $250,000 to infiltrate the private morgue where my father's fake body was processed. His job was to physically swap the blood samples drawn during the initial intake with clean, uncontaminated blood. I was then instructed to forge a flawless toxicology report declaring Winston died of natural, unassisted cardiac arrest. "They are fixing the autopsy," I told my father, reading the final confirmation message Beatrice had just sent. "She is buying a fake toxicology report to secure the $50 million. Once she submits that forged document to the insurance conglomerate, the money will clear, and she will use it to pay off the syndicate threatening Preston. They get to keep their luxurious lives, and they walk away completely clean." Winston looked at the glowing screens of my command center. The blue light cast sharp shadows across his face. "When does she need to submit the forged report?" Winston asked. I checked the insurance policy deadlines. "By the end of the week," I replied. But Preston's cartel debt is due even sooner. They are running out of time. They are terrified, scrambling to cover their tracks before the conglomerate buyers or the syndicate realize what is happening. "Then we are going to push them right over the edge," Winston said, a fierce, predatory smile forming on his lips. "You found their weak point, Genevieve. Preston needs his offshore accounts to look legitimate to the buyers, and Beatrice needs that fake medical report to clear the insurance payout. We are going to take away everything they think they control." I looked back at the intercepted dark web emails. Beatrice thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought her money could buy a clean getaway from murder. She had no idea I was watching her every digital move, holding the power to snap the final thread, keeping her terrible reality together. I turned back to the terminal, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard, ready to strike. I spent the entire night at my secure terminal inside the abandoned farmhouse, compiling the digital evidence of Beatrice's dark web transactions and Preston's massive syndicate debts. I had the power to freeze their accounts right then and there. But before I could trigger the final financial trap, we had to clear one last legal hurdle. The official reading of my father's will was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Winston and I knew that if I did not show up and play my part perfectly, Beatrice would suspect I was building a case against them. I needed to walk into the lion's den, look them in the eye, and let them believe they had completely destroyed me. The waiting room of Thorne and Associates felt less like a law firm and more like a velvet-lined coffin. Dark mahogany walls absorbed the natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. I sat on a rigid leather sofa, clutching my purse, keeping my posture deliberately small and defeated. The air conditioning was freezing, but the real chill in the room came from the two people sitting across from me. Beatrice was draped in a custom black morning dress that likely cost more than a luxury car. She sat with her legs elegantly crossed, sipping sparkling water, and scrolling through her phone with an air of absolute boredom. Preston paced near the window. He was aggressively chewing a piece of gum, his tailored Italian suit practically vibrating with nervous energy. He kept checking his expensive watch, desperately needing this inheritance to clear so he could finalize his company liquidation and pay off the ruthless cartel breathing down his neck. Harrison Thorne, the senior partner of the firm, finally opened his heavy double doors and ushered us inside his sprawling office. Thorne was a man who measured his loyalty strictly by the zeros in his bank account. He had been my father's legal counsel for over a decade, but the moment Winston supposedly died, Thorne immediately aligned himself with Beatrice. He knew exactly where the money was going. "Take a seat, everyone," Thorne said, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses as he settled behind his massive desk. I know this is a difficult time, but Winston was a man of precision. He wanted his affairs handled swiftly and without ambiguity. I took a seat at the far end of the long conference table, putting as much physical distance between myself and my stepfamily as possible. Preston dropped into the chair next to his mother, a smug, greedy smile already spreading across his face. Thorne opened a thick leather binder and pulled out a crisp stack of legal documents. "I have here the last will and testament of Winston, fully updated and notarized just 2 months prior to his passing. I will spare you the standard legal preamble and move directly to the distribution of the primary estate." Beatrice leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the polished wood. "To my beloved wife Beatrice and my legally adopted son Preston, I leave the entirety of my controlling shares in the Logistics Corporation." Thorne read aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I also leave the primary residential estate in the northern suburbs, the vacation properties in Aspen, and all associated liquid investment accounts, blind trusts, and offshore holdings." Preston let out a breath he had clearly been holding. He sank back into his leather chair, running a hand through his expensive haircut. Beatrice simply offered a tight, satisfied smile, exactly like a predator, admiring a fresh kill. They had it all. The entire empire my father built with his own 2 hands was now legally bound to the people who poisoned him. And finally, regarding Genevieve, Thorne continued. He paused, looking up from the documents. He actually had the audacity to look slightly embarrassed. I leaned forward, gripping the edges of my purse, forcing my eyes to widen, as if I was hanging on his every word. "To my biological daughter Genevieve, I leave the deed to the 50-acre industrial plot located on the far south side of the city limits, outside the primary corporate trust." The room went completely silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then Preston threw his head back and let out a loud barking laugh. "The south side plot," Preston choked out, slamming his hand on the table in amusement. "He left her the toxic dirt farm. Are you kidding me? That land has been sitting empty since the late 90s. The soil is basically industrial waste. What are you going to do with that, Genevieve? Grow radioactive tomatoes?" Beatrice placed a hand over Preston's arm, though she was clearly suppressing a laugh of her own. "Now, Preston, be kind. Your father clearly wanted Genevieve to have something to remember him by, even if it is just a useless patch of dirt." She turned her cold, calculating eyes toward me. "You should be grateful, Genevieve. It is more than you deserve after the way you isolated yourself from this family." I stared at the thick stack of papers on Thorne's desk. I had to make this look convincing. I let my shoulders slump forward. I brought my hands up to my face, letting them tremble visibly. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, the exact picture of a broken, humiliated daughter, realizing she had been completely cut out of her father's legacy. I do not understand, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. Why would he do this? He built that company from nothing. I am his daughter. How could he leave everything to you? Because he finally realized who his real family was. Preston sneered, leaning across the table. He realized that a glorified accountant with a bad attitude was never going to carry on his legacy. You are nothing to this family, Genevieve. You have always been nothing. Now sign the paperwork and get out of our sight. I have a company to sell. Thorne slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table, along with a heavy silver pen. This is the acknowledgement of receipt, Genevieve. Signing this simply confirms you accept the terms of the will and the transfer of the industrial deed into your name. I looked at the pen. I let a single calculated tear slip down my cheek. I picked up the silver pen, making sure my hand was shaking so badly that the metal rattled against the wooden table. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, my signature intentionally messy and erratic. Thank you, Thorne said quickly, pulling the paper back before I could change my mind. He handed me a thin manila envelope containing the deed to the 50-acre plot. That concludes our business today. I stood up slowly, clutching the thin envelope to my chest like it was a shield. Beatrice and Preston did not even look at me as I walked out of the office. They were already discussing the corporate liquidation, with Thorne completely ignoring the grieving daughter they had just destroyed. I kept my head down and my shoulders slumped the entire way through the lobby, into the elevator, and out the front doors of the building. I maintained the performance of a shattered woman until I reached my car in the parking garage. The moment I closed my car door, the trembling stopped instantly. I wiped the fake tear from my cheek and tossed the manila envelope onto the passenger seat. I started the engine and smiled. They took the bait perfectly. I drove straight back to the old Miller property on the outskirts of the city. I unlocked the heavy wooden door of the farmhouse and walked down the dusty hallway to the living room. Winston was sitting up in his velvet medical chair, looking significantly better than he had the night before. The cardiac suppression drug was finally leaving his system, and the color was slowly returning to his face. Clara was checking his blood pressure, giving me a quick nod as I entered the room. "How did it go?" my father asked, his voice stronger today. I walked over to his chair and tossed the manila envelope onto his lap. "I gave an Oscar-winning performance, Dad." Preston practically laughed me out of the building. He told me to enjoy growing radioactive tomatoes on my new dirt farm. They think they won. They think they own the entire empire. Winston picked up the manila envelope and pulled out the property deed. He looked at the legal description of the 50-acre industrial plot. Instead of being angry that his wife and stepson had stolen his life's work, a slow, predatory smile spread across my father's face. He started to laugh. It was a deep, rich sound that echoed in the empty farmhouse. "Radioactive tomatoes!" Winston chuckled, shaking his head. Preston always was a short-sighted fool. He never understood how to look beneath the surface of an asset. My father handed the deed back to me and leaned forward. "I intentionally left that specific parcel of land out of the main corporate trust 5 years ago, Genevieve. I kept it hidden in a separate holding company under my personal name. Beatrice and Preston think it is just a contaminated wasteland because I paid a lot of money to make sure the public zoning records looked terrible. But last month, the city council held a closed-door session. I pulled up a chair and sat across from him, my heart racing as I realized where this was going. They approved a massive multi-billion-dollar municipal expansion project." Winston explained, his eyes gleaming with brilliant corporate strategy. "And that 50-acre plot of yours sits directly over the largest completely untapped freshwater aquifer in the entire state of Illinois." I stared at the piece of paper in my hands. The worthless dirt farm was actually a gold mine. "Preston is trying to sell my logistics company to that ruthless conglomerate for $200 million to cover his cartel debts," Winston continued. "But what Preston does not know is that the conglomerate is not buying my firm for the shipping trucks. They are buying it to get their hands on the real estate portfolio. They need water rights for a massive new commercial development they are building on the city borders." I looked at my father, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together in my analytical mind. The conglomerate needs the aquifer. But the aquifer is not part of the corporate portfolio Preston is selling them. Exactly, Winston smiled fiercely. That land belongs entirely to you now, Genevieve. That single 50-acre plot is worth at least $300 million to those conglomerate buyers. You do not just hold a piece of dirt. You hold the absolute leverage that is going to destroy Preston's entire corporate buyout. You are worth more than the entire logistics company. I looked down at the deed, running my fingers over the embossed seal. Beatrice and Preston thought they had outsmarted us. They thought they had secured a fortune while leaving me with nothing but humiliation. They had no idea they had just legally handed me the very weapon I needed to tear their entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. I folded the heavy parchment of the deed and slid it safely back into the manila envelope. The paper felt entirely different in my hands now. It was no longer a symbol of my humiliation. It was charged with the kind of lethal power that could topple a dynasty. My father and I spent the next hour mapping out exactly how we were going to leverage the aquifer against the commercial conglomerate. We needed to time the reveal perfectly to maximize the financial devastation on Preston. But our strategic planning was abruptly cut short. A shrill, piercing alarm suddenly echoed through the dusty living room of the farmhouse. I spun around. One of the secondary monitors on my digital command center was flashing a blinding, urgent red. A critical security breach notification crawled across the screen in bold white letters. The alert was not coming from the logistics company servers. It was coming from my personal apartment in the city. Years ago, because my career as a forensic accountant frequently involved investigating dangerous corporate criminals and volatile offshore syndicates, I had installed military-grade hidden cameras throughout my entire apartment. They were meticulously disguised as smoke detectors, bookshelf speakers, and hallway electrical outlets. They were designed to blend in seamlessly with a standard studio apartment. I rushed to the keyboard and quickly routed the live video feed directly to my main monitor. Two men dressed in dark, unmarked tactical gear had just kicked in my front door. The heavy wood of the door frame splintered, violently raining debris onto my hardwood floors. My father leaned forward in his medical chair, his breathing growing shallow as his eyes fixed on the bright screen. The men stormed into my living room with their weapons drawn. They were not ordinary opportunistic burglars looking for jewelry or cash. They moved with frightening military precision, sweeping the small space methodically before lowering their weapons. Preston must have panicked. After he caught me in the hallway outside his home office during the morning brunch, his paranoia must have gotten the better of him. He knew I was far too smart to just wander around aimlessly looking for an attic. He suspected I had taken something, or at the very least seen something I was not supposed to see on his desk. He undoubtedly went crying to his mother about the encounter, and Beatrice responded the only way she knew how, with absolute, disproportionate brute force. The men tore my apartment apart piece by piece. I watched in cold, detached silence as they flipped over my mattress, sliced open my sofa cushions with hunting knives, and emptied every single drawer in my home office onto the floor. They were looking for cloned hard drives, encrypted flash drives, or physical financial documents. They were tearing my life to shreds, looking for anything that could tie Preston to the missing $40 million. I watched the taller man smash my framed university degree against the wall. The glass shattered everywhere. A sharp surge of violation flushed through my chest, but I forced my analytical mind to remain completely clinical. Let them search. Let them destroy my cheap furniture. The clone of Preston's laptop was sitting securely right in front of me at the abandoned farmhouse. My apartment was completely clean. They were hunting for ghosts. After 20 minutes of aggressive, destructive searching, the taller of the two men pulled out a secure burner phone. He typed a quick message, clearly updating whoever had hired them that the sweep had turned up absolutely nothing. I waited for them to pack up their gear and leave the ruined apartment. But instead of turning toward the broken front door, the man reached deep into the tactical pocket of his black vest. The camera angle mounted above my kitchen cabinets gave me a flawless, unobstructed view of what happened next. The man pulled out a small, unmarked glass vial filled with a clear liquid. He handled it with extreme caution, his hands covered in thick black leather gloves. He walked over to my kitchen counter and opened the high cabinet where I kept my coffee and tea supplies. He reached past the boxes of herbal tea and pushed the glass vial to the very back of the dark shelf, hiding it perfectly behind a large tin of loose-leaf chamomile. Next to me, my father let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The heart monitor attached to his chest spiked rapidly, the rhythmic beeping escalating into a frantic tempo. "I know that vial," Winston whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw horror and profound realization. "That is the exact same custom medical vial Beatrice kept locked inside her private wall safe. Genevieve, that is the Digitalist compound." The puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind with terrifying crystal clarity. Beatrice was not just sending thugs to retrieve stolen data. She was tying up her loose ends. She knew the $50 million life insurance policy required a perfectly clean toxicology report. She was already paying a corrupt, struck-off medical examiner a fortune to forge that report. But Beatrice was calculating. She knew that if any other family member ever contested the death or demanded an independent, secondary autopsy, the Digitalist poison would eventually be found in Winston's blood. Beatrice needed a permanent scapegoat. She needed someone to take the ultimate fall for Winston's murder in case the police ever started asking dangerous questions. And who better to frame than the estranged, bitter daughter who had just been publicly humiliated at the funeral reception? She planted the murder weapon right in my kitchen. Beatrice was planning to serve me to the Chicago Police Department on a silver platter. It was a brilliant, evil stroke of strategy. If I was sitting in a federal prison awaiting trial for patricide, I could not challenge her legal authority. I could not investigate Preston's embezzlement. My credibility as a forensic accountant would be completely destroyed. A convicted murderer could not challenge a will. The two men quickly wiped down the kitchen cabinet doors with chemical cloths, grabbed their tactical bags, and slipped out the back fire escape of my building. The live camera feed showed my apartment sitting silent, empty, and completely destroyed. The vial of poison waited in the dark like a ticking time bomb. I reached for my cell phone to call my private security contact, but before I could dial a single number, a second blaring alert triggered on my monitoring system. This notification came from the exterior cameras mounted on the front security gate of my apartment complex. I quickly switched the video feed. My breath caught sharply in my throat. 4 black and white Chicago police cruisers were swarming the parking lot. Their flashing red and blue lights illuminated the brick exterior of my apartment building, painting the walls in frantic colors. Heavily armed officers were already pouring out of the vehicles. They were unholstering their weapons and sprinting toward the front entrance of the complex. Beatrice had not waited a single second. The moment her hired thugs confirmed the Digitalis vial was planted, she must have placed an anonymous, untraceable tip to the police department. She probably claimed she had seen me handling suspicious medical supplies or fabricated a story about overhearing me threatening my father's life just days before his sudden heart attack. Whatever lie she spun, she gave the detectives exactly enough probable cause to execute an immediate emergency raid on my residence. I stood frozen in the dusty living room of the farmhouse, watching the police officers on my screen kick open the heavy glass lobby doors of my building. They were rushing up the central staircase with their weapons drawn, heading straight for my floor. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. If I had gone straight home after the will reading at the law firm, instead of coming back to the old Miller property, I would be in handcuffs right now. I would be thrown against the wall of my own kitchen, arrested for the brutal murder of the man who was currently sitting right next to me. Beatrice had just escalated this situation from a corporate financial takeover to a deadly high-stakes game of survival. She had weaponized the entire justice system against me, and the police were now actively hunting me down. Running was exactly what Beatrice wanted me to do. Fleeing the city would instantly brand me a fugitive, confirming every vicious lie she had fed the Chicago Police Department. If I disappeared into the night, my absence would be broadcast across the morning news as a silent admission of guilt. I reached over and disconnected the main hard drive from my terminal. I was not going to run. I was going to walk right through their front doors. I spent the next 40 minutes compiling a master forensic dossier. My hands moved across the keyboard with practiced, lethal precision. I printed the encrypted email chains between Beatrice and the black market medical examiner. I printed the blockchain transaction receipts proving Beatrice bought the Digitalis compound. Then I ran a reverse trace on the origin of the anonymous tip that had triggered the raid on my apartment. The police thought that they were protecting an anonymous concerned citizen. They had no idea how easy it was for someone with my skill set to peel back the layers of a masked digital footprint. The IP address pinged directly to a private, highly secure VIP network. I matched the network ID to the exact country club where my father's reception had been held just hours ago. The specific access point belonged to a private luxury suite registered exclusively to Preston. He had placed the call to the police while he was drinking champagne and laughing at my expense. I printed every single routing protocol, highlighting the exact timestamps. I packed the thick stack of papers into my leather briefcase. I left my father safely locked inside the farmhouse, resting under the watchful eyes of Dr. Linus and Clara. I promised him I would be back before sunrise. I drove through the dark city streets toward the Central Police Precinct downtown. The drive was tense. Every siren I heard echoing through the concrete canyons made my grip on the steering wheel tighten. I parked 2 blocks away and walked into the brightly lit precinct lobby. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The desk sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork until I announced my full name. The shift in the room was immediate and violent. 3 uniformed officers instantly dropped what they were doing and grabbed their radios. A heavy wooden door swung open and 2 plainclothes detectives marched out into the lobby. Their expressions were hard, aggressive, and completely unforgiving. They did not ask me any questions. They grabbed me by the arms, escorted me through a maze of busy desks, and shoved me into a small, windowless interrogation room. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and harsh floor wax. A heavy metal table sat bolted to the center of the floor. Detective Carter, a broad-shouldered man with a tight jaw and tired eyes, slammed a thick manila folder onto the metal surface. His partner, Detective Ramirez, leaned his weight against the closed door, entirely blocking my exit. They tried to break me down immediately. They used every intimidation tactic in the book. Carter paced around the room telling me they knew all about the terrible tension at the funeral. They knew I had been estranged from the family. They told me my stepmother had called them in hysterics, expressing grave concerns about my mental stability and my bitter obsession with my father's wealth. Then Carter played his ace. He leaned over the table, placing both his hands flat on the metal surface, getting right into my face. He told me his tactical team had just concluded a raid on my downtown apartment. He smiled a cold, triumphant smile as he said they found a hidden glass vial of pure digitalis stuffed behind my tea tins. He accused me of murdering my father in cold blood for an inheritance I felt I was owed. He told me I was going to federal prison for the rest of my life. I did not cry. I did not panic. I did not ask for a lawyer. I calmly reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, meticulously organized forensic dossier I had printed at the farmhouse. I slid the heavy stack of papers across the metal table, stopping it right against Carter's chest. I looked him dead in the eye and properly introduced myself. I told him I was not a bitter, struggling daughter. I was a senior forensic auditor who specialized in tracking offshore financial syndicates and dismantling corporate embezzlement rings. I told Carter to open the folder and look at page 4. Carter hesitated, glancing at Ramirez before flipping the heavy cover open. I walked him through the IP trace of the anonymous tip. I explained exactly how network triangulation proved the call originated from Preston's private country club suite at the exact time Beatrice was staging her tearful performance in the banquet hall. I pointed to the specific router logs showing how Preston had tried to bounce his signal through a proxy server, but failed to mask his device's unique media access control address. Ramirez stepped away from the door, his eyes narrowing as he walked over to look over Carter's shoulder. I instructed them to turn to page 12. I showed them the dark web cryptocurrency ledger. I traced the transaction hashes step by step, linking a supposedly anonymous purchase of pure digitalis directly to a shell account. I showed them the banking transfer records that proved that specific shell account was funded entirely by Beatrice's personal offshore banking portfolio. I tapped my finger against the timestamp on the page. The poison was purchased 6 months ago, exactly when my father's health mysteriously began to decline. The aggressive, dominant energy in the interrogation room completely evaporated. Carter sank slowly into the hard plastic chair opposite me. He flipped through the pages of undeniable hard data, his eyes scanning the banking numbers and server logs. Ramirez pulled out his phone, already quietly typing in the IP addresses I had provided to verify my claims through their own cyber division. They realized in real time that they had been completely played. Beatrice had used the police department as her own personal attack dogs to tie up her loose ends. I did not stop there. I told them my father's body was not in that casket they buried today. I told them Beatrice was currently negotiating a massive cash bribe with a disgraced medical examiner to forge a toxicology report. I explained she needed the clean report to secure a $50 million life insurance payout before Preston was murdered by a gambling syndicate. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the metal table. I offered to hand them the corrupt examiner Preston's cartel connections and Beatrice on a silver platter. But I told them they had to stand down immediately. If they arrested me tonight, Beatrice would know she was caught, and she would destroy the rest of the evidence. I needed them to hold off on any warrants and let me finish tracking the money. The detectives exchanged a long, heavy look. Carter closed the dossier and rubbed his temples. Ramirez pocketed his phone, giving his partner a slow, confirming nod. My data was real. My evidence was bulletproof. Carter looked at me, a newfound respect replacing his earlier hostility. He told me I was free to go. He agreed to temporarily suspend the arrest warrant regarding the vial found in my apartment. But he made it clear I was not entirely cleared until their cyber division authenticated every single page of my report in detail. He warned me that if I was playing them, he would hunt me down himself. I stood up, smoothed the minor wrinkles from my sensible black suit, and picked up my empty briefcase. I thanked them for their time and walked out the front doors of the precinct, a completely free woman. Beatrice's ultimate deadly trap had completely failed. She thought she had successfully framed me for murder, but all she had done was hand me the exact police contacts I needed to ensure her eventual arrest. I got back into my car and drove toward the farmhouse. The streets were quiet, the city lights reflecting off the dark pavement. I had neutralized the immediate threat of prison, but the war was far from over. Chris and Preston still believed I was running from the law. They still believed they were hours away from securing a massive fortune. It was time to take the offensive. It was time to break their minds before I broke their bank accounts. I pulled up to the abandoned farmhouse and hurried inside to my command center. My father was still resting, his breathing much steadier now. I sat down at my glowing monitors and cracked my knuckles. I was going to use my backdoor access to the family mansion's smart home network to turn their luxurious fortress into an absolute nightmare. I did not hesitate for a single second. Beatrice had spent years transforming the family mansion into a state-of-the-art technological marvel. She loved bragging to her high society friends about the heavily interconnected smart home system that controlled everything from the heated bathroom floors to the surround sound audio and automated security gates. To her, it was an expensive status symbol. To me, it was an unlocked back door. I routed my digital connection through the secure proxy servers I had established earlier that day. Entering the mansion's residential network was embarrassingly simple. Preston had authorized an emergency upgrade to the corporate firewalls to protect his illegal financial activities, but he had completely neglected the residential network of the estate. Within minutes, I had administrative override control of the entire property. The climate control, the interior security cameras, the intercoms, and Beatrice's highly customized synchronized smart mirrors were all resting right at my fingertips. I checked the glowing digital clock on my monitor. It was exactly 2:45 in the morning. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from a thermos, sat back in my chair and waited for the clock to strike 3. At exactly 3 in the morning, I initiated the first sequence of my psychological strike. I bypassed the master bedroom thermostat and dropped the ambient temperature from a comfortable 72 degrees straight down to 62 degrees. It was the exact freezing temperature my father always insisted on, keeping the house a specific habit that used to drive Beatrice to absolute distraction during their marriage. I watched through the discreet security camera mounted in the upstairs hallway as the massive central air conditioning units kicked into high gear. 5 minutes later, I engaged the mansion's integrated audio system. I did not blast the music. I kept the volume intentionally low, creating a sound that was almost like a ghost whispering through the massive empty corridors. I selected a vintage jazz track, the exact record my father played every single Sunday morning in his ground floor study. The smooth, melancholy notes drifted slowly through the hidden ceiling speakers. On my monitor, the heavy oak door of the master suite swung open. Beatrice stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. She was wrapped tightly in a silk robe, shivering visibly in the freezing air. She looked around the empty corridor, confused and severely disoriented. She walked quickly toward the central control panel mounted on the wall, stabbing her perfectly manicured fingers against the digital screen to turn off the music and raise the heat. I locked her out of the system. The screen flashed a bright red error message right in her face. Beatrice turned away from the panel, her breathing quickening visibly on the camera feed. She hurried toward the master bathroom to grab her cell phone. Beatrice had recently installed massive custom-ordered smart mirrors that displayed her daily schedule, weather updates, and news feeds while she got ready in the morning. I accessed the mirror's visual display matrix. As she stepped in front of the glass to check her pale reflection, I executed the visual override command. The mirror glitched instantly. The smooth surface rippled with digital static. Then for exactly 2 seconds, a high-definition, unsmiling image of Winston's face flashed entirely across the glass. It stared directly into her eyes before vanishing back to a normal reflection. Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She stumbled backward, tripping over the long hem of her silk robe and crashed hard onto the expensive bathroom tiles. She scrambled backward like a panicked animal, pressing herself deep into the corner of the wall and clutching her chest. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She thought her murdered husband was actively haunting the very house she had stolen from him. The violent commotion woke Preston. I watched on the hallway camera as he sprinted out of the South Wing guest suite. He was wearing loose sweatpants and holding a heavy brass golf club like a weapon. He rushed into the master suite and found his mother trembling on the bathroom floor. She was pointing frantically at the blank mirror, crying and babbling incoherently about Winston's ghost and the freezing temperature in the room. Preston looked around the master suite, his chest heaving as he gripped the golf club. He heard the jazz music playing softly from the ceiling speakers. He felt the biting 62-degree chill settling into his bones. But Preston was arrogant, not superstitious. He knew exactly what this was. He knew dead men did not hack smart home hubs. He knew exactly who had the technical capability to infiltrate his secure network and execute a psychological attack of this magnitude. My secure burner phone buzzed violently on the desk beside my keyboard. The caller ID displayed Preston's private cell phone number. I let it ring 3 times to build the tension before I finally answered the call and put it on speaker without saying a single word. "What the hell are you doing?" Genevieve Preston hissed into the receiver. His voice was frantic, completely unhinged. I remained absolutely silent, letting his mounting panic fill the dusty living room of the farmhouse. "You think you are so smart," Preston screamed, his voice cracking under the pressure. "You think playing these stupid hacker games is going to change anything? Turn the system back on right now. You are terrifying my mother. You are a psychotic freak. You sound stressed, Preston." I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Is the temperature not to your liking? Or is the illegal cartel debt finally keeping you awake at night?" I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The reality that I knew about his massive $40 million gambling deficit hit him like a freight train. "You do not know anything about my business," Preston snarled, but the fear in his voice was palpable. "You are just a bitter loser who got cut out of the will. I know exactly what you are trying to do. You called the police on your own apartment tonight. You planted that vial to make it look like we are framing you. You are trying to set us up." I let out a slow, calculated laugh. "You are giving me far too much credit, Preston. I did not call the police. You did. And I already proved to the detectives downtown that the anonymous tip originated from your private network at the country club." I also handed them the dark web receipts showing Beatrice purchased the digitalis poison. The silence on the phone was deafening. Preston realized his mother's flawless murder plot had completely unraveled. He was trapped, cornered by his own monumental greed. But cornered animals always lash out, and Preston was desperate. "Listen to me very carefully," Preston said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening register. "I do not care what fake documents you handed the police. You might think you hold the cards right now, but I have weapons you cannot even comprehend. I leaned closer to the speaker. Enlighten me. The conglomerate buyers are getting cold feet, Preston admitted his desperation, pushing him to lay his cards on the table. They are stalling the $200 million buyout. They want a sweetener to close the deal. They need water rights for their new commercial development, and they know you hold the deed to the aquifer on the south side. I know, I said calmly, and I am never going to give it to you. You are going to sign that land over to my corporate portfolio by noon tomorrow, Preston demanded. Because if you refuse, I am going to destroy your life permanently. He took a ragged breath before dropping his ultimate threat. I used an advanced artificial intelligence deepfake program, Preston explained, his tone laced with vicious triumph. I generated a flawless high-definition audio recording of your voice. In the recording, you break down crying. You confess to poisoning Winston because you were jealous and resentful of his wealth. You admit to buying the digitalis yourself. The deepfake is absolute perfection, Genevieve. No forensic audio expert will be able to debunk it before the police drag you out of whatever hole you are hiding in and throw you in a federal cell. My hands tightened into fists. Preston had bypassed traditional evidence and created a digital confession that could ruin my credibility forever. If I do not have your signature on that property transfer by noon tomorrow, Preston threatened. And I am releasing that confession to every major news outlet in Chicago. The police will have no choice but to arrest you. Your career will be over. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, and I will take the land anyway. You have until noon tomorrow, Genevieve. Sign the paper, or your life is over. Preston ended the call, leaving a heavy dial-tone silence in the room. I looked across the command center at my father, who had been listening to the entire exchange. The psychological warfare had successfully broken their nerves, but Preston had just raised the stakes to a deadly level. He needed my land to save his own life from the cartel, and he was willing to digitally frame me for murder to get it. The sharp click of the disconnecting call echoed through the quiet, dusty living room of the abandoned farmhouse. I did not throw my phone against the wall. I did not scream or cry or panic. I simply set the device face down on my desk and took a slow, deep breath. Preston thought a fabricated artificial intelligence audio file was the ultimate weapon. He truly believed he could corner a senior forensic accountant by threatening her personal reputation. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war we were currently fighting. I did not care about public opinion. I cared about absolute, undeniable financial destruction. My father was watching me from his medical chair. The steady rhythm of his heart monitor filled the silence in the room. He had heard every single word of Preston's deranged ultimatum. "I is desperate," Winston stated, his voice calm, but laced with a sharp, predatory edge. "The conglomerate buyers are stalling the $200 million acquisition. They know something is wrong with the corporate portfolio. Preston needs your aquifer to blind them with potential profits, so they do not look too closely at the operational budgets he completely drained. If he does not close that deal, the cartel will kill him by the end of the week. And if I do not sign over the deed by noon tomorrow," I replied, my fingers hovering over my keyboard, "he is going to release a fake confession framing me for your murder. He thinks he has me trapped in a corner." I turned back to my glowing monitors. The cloned data from Preston's hard drive was still open on my screen. "It is time to show my stepbrother exactly what happens when you threaten the person holding the keys to your entire financial existence," I said. I did not need to hack into his bank accounts to steal his money. Stealing the money would make me a criminal. I was a forensic auditor. I used the law as my weapon. Over the past 24 hours, I had meticulously compiled every single fraudulent invoice, every illegal offshore transfer, and every dark web cryptocurrency transaction Preston had executed to pay his gambling debts. I packaged all of this damning evidence into 3 highly encrypted automated data packets. I targeted the automated compliance and anti-money laundering divisions of the 3 major global banks that held Preston's offshore and domestic wealth. I also included the corporate accounts for the logistics company, ensuring that the financial blast radius would encompass his entire newly acquired empire. "When do you want to detonate it?" Winston asked, leaning forward in his chair to watch my screens. I pulled up Preston's digital calendar, which I had synced from his cloned hard drive. At exactly 1 o'clock this afternoon, Preston is hosting a highly publicized power lunch at the Sterling Prime Steakhouse downtown. He is meeting with the two lead acquisition executives from the commercial conglomerate. He is going to use that lunch to convince them that the logistics company is perfectly healthy and ready to be sold. I typed a sequence of execution commands into my terminal. I set a digital timer ticking down in bright red numbers on my screen. I am going to freeze every single asset he has right in the middle of his expensive appetizers, I said, pressing the enter key to lock the protocol in place. The next few hours passed in a state of tense, calculated anticipation. I used a simple networking trick to tap into the steakhouse's wireless internet connection, granting me access to the restaurant's high-definition security cameras. By 12:45, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of Preston's private corner booth. Preston arrived wearing a brand new custom-tailored suit. He looked incredibly smug, completely unaware of the digital guillotine hanging right above his neck. He greeted the two older, stern-looking conglomerate executives with excessive confidence. He ordered a bottle of champagne that likely cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He leaned back in his leather booth, gesturing expansively as he pitched the sale of my father's legacy. I could practically see the arrogance radiating from his posture. He thought he had the entire world wrapped around his finger. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the digital timer on my screen hit 0. My automated data packets launched simultaneously across the globe. They hit the compliance servers of the international banks like a financial missile strike. The algorithms I had designed immediately triggered severe anti-money laundering protocols. Because the evidence of Preston's cartel transactions was so clear and overwhelmingly documented, the banks did not wait to ask questions. They executed immediate emergency asset freezes to protect themselves from federal liability. I watched the security camera feed intently. For 5 minutes, nothing happened at the restaurant. Preston continued laughing and drinking his champagne. Then the waiter approached their table carrying a sleek black leather checkbook. Preston casually reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his heavy platinum corporate credit card. He handed it to the waiter without even glancing at the total, wanting to project an image of unlimited wealth and power to the buyer sitting across from him. The waiter bowed politely and walked away to the service station. I switched my camera feed to watch the transaction terminal. The waiter swiped the platinum card. A bright red error message immediately flashed on the register. The waiter frowned, typed something into the machine, and swiped the card a second time. The same red rejection message appeared. The waiter returned to the table looking incredibly uncomfortable. He leaned down and whispered something quietly into Preston's ear. Preston's arrogant smile vanished instantly. He looked annoyed, clearly thinking it was just a minor banking error. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his personal black card, handing it over with a dismissive wave of his hand. I watched the waiter return to the terminal. He swiped the personal card. Denied. The account was completely frozen. Back at the table, Preston's cell phone suddenly lit up on the white tablecloth. Then his smartwatch illuminated. Then the phone began to vibrate violently, buzzing uncontrollably against the wood. I had access to his notification logs through the cloned drive. I watched my screen as a tidal wave of automated banking alerts flooded Preston's devices. Warning: account suspended pending federal compliance review. Alert: offshore trust restricted due to suspected fraudulent activity. Notice: corporate ledger locked by International Fraud Division. On the restaurant security camera, I watched Preston pick up his phone. All the color instantly drained from his face. He looked like he had just been physically struck. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing in absolute, unadulterated panic. He swiped frantically through his banking applications. Every single one of them displayed a balance of 0 available funds. He was entirely locked out of his own life. The two conglomerate executives sitting across from him noticed the drastic shift in his demeanor. They stopped drinking their champagne. They exchanged a very sharp, highly calculated look. These men were apex predators in the corporate world. They could smell financial blood in the water from a mile away. Suddenly, the lead executive's phone began to ring. It was an urgent call from his own corporate risk management department. The global financial sector moves fast when $40 million of cartel debt triggers an investigation. The executive answered the phone, listened for exactly 15 seconds, and ended the call. His expression turned completely to ice. I could not hear the audio from the restaurant camera, but the body language told the entire story. The executive placed his phone flat on the table and leaned forward, staring a hole straight through Preston. Preston was sweating profusely now. He was shaking his head, waving his hands in frantic, jerky motions, clearly trying to invent a lie to explain why his entire financial portfolio had just been flagged by international authorities. The executives were not buying a single word of it. They both stood up from the table in unison. They buttoned their suit jackets with cold, synchronized precision. Preston reached out physically, begging them to stay, desperately trying to keep the $200 million deal alive. The lead executive pointed a rigid finger directly at Preston's chest. He delivered an ultimatum that was so forceful, Preston physically shrank back into his leather booth. I knew exactly what the executive was saying because it was standard corporate acquisition protocol for a breach of this magnitude. They were pulling out of the deal. They were not going to wire $200 million to a man currently under investigation for international money laundering. Preston buried his face in his hands as the two billionaires walked out of the restaurant, leaving him sitting alone with an unpaid bill and a frozen bank account. My burner phone buzzed on the desk next to my keyboard. I picked it up and answered. "What did you do?" Preston screamed into the receiver. His voice was completely shattered. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. "What did you do to my accounts? Everything is gone. My cards are declining. The banks are telling me I am under federal review." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the taste of absolute control. "I warned you not to threaten me, Preston. You wanted to play games with my reputation. I decided to play a game with your survival." "You ruined the deal!" He sobbed, the panic completely overtaking his false bravado. "The buyers walked out. They told me the acquisition is dead unless I can provide a flawless third-party forensic audit proving the company ledgers are entirely clean. They gave me exactly 48 hours. They said if I do not present a perfectly clean financial portfolio by the annual shareholder gala on Saturday night, they are reporting the corporate discrepancies to the Securities and Exchange Commission." "That sounds like a very stressful situation for you," I replied coldly, "especially since we both know you cannot provide a clean ledger. You embezzled $40 million. The company is bankrupt. And the syndicate is going to collect their debt whether you close this deal or not. I am going to kill you." Preston roared, his voice cracking hysterically. "I am going to release the deepfake confession. I am going to send the police to your door. If you release that fake audio, I will send the cartel your exact GPS coordinates." I countered, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You have 48 hours until the shareholder gala, Preston. You better spend that time figuring out how to explain to your mother that you just lost the entire empire she killed her husband to steal." I ended the call and blocked his number. I leaned back in my chair and looked over at my father. Winston was smiling. The trap was set perfectly. Preston and Beatrice were completely out of money, out of time, and trapped in a corner. Desperation was going to force them to make a catastrophic mistake, and we were going to be waiting right there when they did. I kept my eyes locked on the surveillance feeds broadcasting from the family mansion. The digital trap I sprang on Preston at the steakhouse had worked flawlessly, but cornering a predator only makes them more dangerous. I watched the live video from the hidden camera positioned in the grand foyer of the estate. The heavy front doors flew open and slammed against the marble walls with a violent crash. Preston stormed inside. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled. His tie was ripped open, and his face was pale with a sickening layer of sweat. He looked exactly like a man who knew he was running out of time to live. Beatrice rushed out of the formal dining room to meet him. She was holding a large glass of bourbon, completely abandoning her usual daytime champagne. Her nerves were entirely frayed from the psychological warfare I had waged on her the night before. The freezing temperatures and the image of my father flashing in her smart mirror had stripped away her arrogant composure. She looked fragile and terrified, jumping at the loud noise of the door. "What happened?" Beatrice demanded, grabbing Preston by the arm. "Why are you back so early from the conglomerate meeting?" Did they sign the acquisition papers? Preston pulled his arm away violently. He paced in a tight circle on the marble floor, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. "There is no acquisition," he shouted, his voice echoing up the grand staircase. "The deal is completely dead. The buyers walked out on me. Someone triggered a massive international compliance freeze on every single one of my accounts. My corporate cards declined at the table. The global banks locked my offshore trusts. I have absolutely nothing, Mom. My net worth is zero." Beatrice dropped her bourbon glass. It shattered across the expensive imported rug, soaking into the fabric, but neither of them cared. "What are you talking about?" she gasped, pressing her hands to her pale face. "How is that even possible? We own a logistics empire." "We do not own anything!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "Genevieve did this. She is not just some quiet accountant. She hacked my entire financial portfolio. She knows about the $40 million I lost to the gambling syndicate. She froze the money to stop the corporate buyout." Beatrice stumbled backward against the wall. The reality of their situation was crashing down around her. If Genevieve was capable of freezing international banking assets, then the ghost in the mirror last night was not a supernatural event. It was a targeted digital attack. Beatrice realized I had been inside their house, inside their network, and inside their most guarded secrets. Preston grabbed his mother by the shoulders, shaking her slightly to force her to focus. You do not understand how bad this is," he pleaded, tears of genuine terror welling in his eyes. "The syndicate gave me an ultimatum. I leveraged my position at the company to borrow that money. If I do not wire them $40 million by the end of the week, they are going to kill me. They are going to send people to this house, and they are going to execute me." Beatrice stared at her son. Her maternal instinct to protect her golden child instantly overrode her fear. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and forced her posture to straighten. The corporate acquisition was dead, but she still had one final massive card left to play. "We do not need the commercial conglomerate," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a harsh, calculated whisper. "We still have Winston's supplemental life insurance policy. It pays out $50 million in tax-free cash. That is more than enough to pay off the syndicate and relocate us somewhere safe until we can deal with Genevieve permanently." Preston shook his head frantically. "We cannot access that money without a clean post-mortem toxicology report. If the insurance investigators look too closely, they will find the digitalist poison in his blood. They will know we killed him. We will spend the rest of our lives in federal prison." "I already handled it," Beatrice snapped, her eyes narrowing with vicious determination. "I paid Harrison Thorne to secure a struck-off medical examiner from the black market. The examiner swapped the blood samples at the private morgue this morning. He is generating a flawless, perfectly clean toxicology report as we speak. We just need Thorne to deliver the document so we can file the claim." Sitting in the abandoned farmhouse, I leaned closer to my monitors. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I immediately shifted my focus away from the mansion security cameras. I needed to intercept any communication between Beatrice and the corrupt family lawyer Harrison Thorne. I routed my hacking software through Thorne's professional legal network. Because I had already breached the family's administrative systems, bypassing Thorne's email encryption took less than 3 minutes. I found exactly what I was looking for. An encrypted email had just landed in Beatrice's private inbox. The sender was listed under a secure alias, but the digital signature belonged entirely to Harrison Thorne. I opened the intercepted message on my screen. My father wheeled his medical chair closer, reading the text over my shoulder. The email was short and entirely strictly business. Thorne confirmed that the black market medical examiner had received the final installment of the $250,000 bribe. Attached to the email was a highly secured PDF file. I downloaded the attachment and cracked the password protection. It was the forged official toxicology report for Winston. I scanned the medical data. It was a masterpiece of scientific fiction. The corrupt examiner had meticulously documented standard cholesterol levels, normal enzyme counts, and a completely fabricated history of minor arterial blockages. The official cause of death was listed as a massive unassisted myocardial infarction. The report stated there were absolutely no foreign substances, toxins, or digitalis compounds present in my father's bloodstream. To an insurance executive or a local police detective, the document would look entirely legitimate. Beatrice has the fake report I told my father, pulling up the digital timestamp on the file. She is going to submit this to the life insurance conglomerate immediately. Once they review this, they will authorize the $50 million wire transfer. Preston will have the cash to pay off his cartel debts. Winston stared at the forged document on my screen. His expression was dangerously calm. Read the rest of the email chain, Genevieve. Beatrice is arrogant, but she is also deeply paranoid. She will not just submit a file through a standard web portal and hope for the best. She wants a spectacle. I scrolled down through the earlier messages in the intercepted thread. My father was absolutely right. Beatrice was not just filing a simple insurance claim. She had coordinated a massive, highly public trap. According to her correspondence with Thorne, Beatrice had personally invited the lead executives from the life insurance conglomerate to attend the annual shareholder gala scheduled for tomorrow night. She planned to hand-deliver the clean toxicology report to them directly in front of the entire corporate board of directors. She wanted to use the high society event to force their hand, using public pressure to expedite the $50 million payout. But as I dug deeper into the email thread, my blood ran completely cold. The financial scheme was only the first half of their plan. Preston had replied to the email chain just 20 minutes ago, outlining the second phase of their attack. Preston told his mother that freezing his bank accounts was my biggest mistake. He stated that the artificial intelligence deepfake audio of my voice was rendering perfectly on his secure servers. He had successfully generated a pristine high-definition recording of me sobbing and confessing to purchasing the Digitalist compound to murder my father. But Preston was not going to simply email the fake audio to the local news stations. He wanted a public execution. I read the final paragraph of Preston's email out loud, my voice tight with suppressed anger. He paid off a high-ranking police captain in the downtown precinct using the last of his hidden cash reserves. The captain agreed to bypass standard authentication protocols. Preston is going to play the fake audio confession over the main ballroom speakers during the shareholder gala tomorrow night. Winston gripped the armrests of his medical chair. He is going to frame you in front of the city's entire elite class. Yes, I said, staring at the chilling words on my monitor. Beatrice will hand the insurance executives the clean toxicology report to secure the $50 million. Then Preston will play the fake confession to the shareholders. He wrote that the bribed police captain will be waiting in the wings with handcuffs. They are going to have me publicly arrested for patricide in the middle of the ballroom. By the time I can hire a digital forensics expert to prove the audio is a deepfake, I will already be rotting in a federal holding cell, and they will be on a private jet with $50 million in cash. The silence in the farmhouse was absolute. The portable generator hummed in the background, a stark contrast to the massive life-altering collision course we were now locked onto. Beatrice and Preston were desperate, backed into a corner by the cartel and my financial tripwires. They were throwing everything they had into one final explosive performance at the shareholder gala. They intended to walk out of that ballroom as wealthy, grieving victims, while I was dragged away as a disgraced, murderous daughter. I looked at my father. He had regained his color, and the lethal intelligence in his eyes burned brighter than ever. He slowly removed the IV drip from his arm and pressed a cotton swab to the site. He did not need the medication anymore. He was ready. They want a public spectacle, Winston said softly, standing up from the velvet armchair for the first time in a week. They want to use my legacy to destroy my daughter and steal my fortune. I closed the encrypted email files and shut down my hacking terminal. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the physical property deed to the municipal aquifer, the ultimate financial weapon. Then we will give them exactly the audience they requested, I replied, standing up to face him. We have 48 hours to prepare, Dad. Tomorrow night at the gala, Beatrice and Preston think they are setting a trap for a glorified calculator. We are going to show them what happens when you try to bury the two smartest people in the room. The grand ballroom of the opulent Chicago Plaza Hotel was drowning in crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive desperation. I sat in my car across the street, watching the city elite pour through the gilded front doors. The annual shareholder gala was always a spectacle, but tonight it was a heavily orchestrated illusion. Preston and Beatrice were inside playing the roles of the confident grieving successors. They were throwing a multi-million-dollar party, using the last drops of the company credit lines. They needed this visual display of power to convince the commercial conglomerate buyers that the logistics empire was perfectly stable and ready for a $200 million acquisition. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was not wearing my sensible black suit. Tonight I wore a floor-length custom silk emerald gown that caught the streetlights and shifted like deep water. But the dress was not my primary weapon. The weapon rested heavily against my collarbone. Before my mother passed away, she had secured her vintage diamond necklace in a private bank vault under my name. Beatrice had spent the last 15 years turning the family mansion upside down looking for those diamonds. She assumed my father had hidden them or sold them to fund a business venture. She never knew they belonged entirely to me. Wearing them tonight was a calculated psychological strike. It was a visual declaration that I possessed assets, resources, and secrets they could not even begin to touch. I stepped out of the car. The evening air was bitter and cold, but I did not feel it. I walked past the busy valet line and up the wide marble steps. Two private security guards stood at the entrance checking embossed invitations. I did not have one. I did not need one. I pulled out my corporate administrative identification card, the one Preston claimed he had permanently deactivated. He had disabled the physical doors at the mansion, but he was far too inept to realize my high-level clearance still governed the corporate event rosters. I tapped the card against their digital scanner. The screen flashed green immediately. The guards stepped aside without a single word. I paused just outside the massive double doors of the ballroom. I could hear a smooth jazz band playing and the low, wealthy murmur of hundreds of guests. I took a slow breath, smoothed the silk of my emerald gown, and pushed the heavy wooden doors wide open. The transition was immediate and violent. The moment I stepped onto the plush carpet of the ballroom, the entire energy in the space shifted. The conversations nearest the door simply stopped. Heads turned. The silence moved through the crowd like a shockwave rippling outward until it reached the very center of the room. Beatrice and Preston were standing near the main stage holding court with the two lead executives from the commercial conglomerate. I watched Beatrice perfectly clearly. She was laughing at something one of the billionaires said elegantly, holding a crystal flute of champagne. Then she noticed the creeping silence. She turned her head and her eyes locked onto mine across the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. All the blood instantly drained from Beatrice's face. She did not just see my emerald gown. Her eyes zeroed in directly on my mother's vintage diamonds glittering fiercely at my throat. Her mouth parted in absolute unadulterated shock. The pristine, untouchable image she had curated for the conglomerate buyers cracked right down the middle. She realized in a fraction of a second that she had absolutely no control over my actions tonight. Preston followed his mother's terrified gaze. His reaction was far less composed. His face flushed a dark, violent red. He dropped his drink onto a passing waiter's tray, the glass shattering loudly and aggressively shoved his way through the crowd of shareholders. Two large, broad-shouldered corporate security guards flanked him immediately, reading his highly hostile body language. I did not wait for him to reach the entrance. I began walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me instinctively. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting the vintage diamonds catch the light of the chandeliers above. I projected nothing but absolute financial dominance. "What are you doing here?" Preston hissed as he intercepted me halfway to the stage. His voice was a venomous whisper, desperately trying to contain his rage in front of the wealthy audience. "I told you that you were permanently cut off. You are trespassing on private corporate property." I smiled at him. It was a cold, empty smile. "I am a primary shareholder, Preston, and I am the biological daughter of the man who built this room. I have every right to be here." Preston signaled the two security guards hovering behind him. "Grab her arms and drag her out the back service elevator," he commanded quietly. "If she screams, put a hand over her mouth." The guards stepped forward, raising their hands, but I did not flinch. I looked directly at the larger of the two men. "If you touch me," I said, my voice completely level and terrifyingly calm, You will be assisting in a corporate kidnapping of a federal financial auditor in front of 300 witnesses and multiple news cameras. I suggest you check with your union representative before you ruin your life for a man who cannot even pay your salary tomorrow morning." The security guard hesitated. He looked at Preston, then back at me, rapidly calculating the legal risk. In that split second of hesitation, I bypassed them completely. I stepped gracefully around Preston and walked directly up the small set of stairs leading to the main stage. "Get away from there!" Preston shouted, completely abandoning his professional facade. Several shareholders gasped at his sudden aggressive outburst. I walked straight to the podium and wrapped my hand around the microphone. A sharp feedback whine echoed through the ballroom, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The jazz band stopped playing. I looked down at the sea of faces. I found the two lead executives from the commercial conglomerate standing near the front row. They were watching me with intense, calculating curiosity. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the massive space. "For those who do not know me, my name is Genevieve. I am Winston's daughter. And I know my stepbrother Preston has been pitching you a very colorful, very expensive story about the future of this logistics company." Preston scrambled up the stairs of the stage, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the wood. "Turn off the microphone," he screamed at the audio technicians who were frozen by the mixing boards. "Turn it off right now." I ignored him and kept my eyes locked directly on the conglomerate executives. "You are here tonight because you want to finalize a $200 million acquisition. But you are not buying this company for the shipping fleet or the aging warehouses. Your internal risk management department knows the logistics market is saturated. You are buying this company because you are planning a massive commercial development on the city borders, and you desperately need the municipal water rights to break ground." The two billionaires stiffened. Their posture changed instantly. They realized I had completely decoded their hidden corporate strategy. Preston reached the podium, his hand shooting out to violently grab the microphone from my grip. I stepped gracefully to the side, pulling the microphone off its stand and taking it with me to the center of the stage. "What my stepbrother failed to mention during your expensive lunch meetings," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage to avoid Preston, "is that the logistics company does not own those water rights. The commercial trust Preston currently controls does not include the 50-acre industrial plot sitting directly over the new municipal aquifer." The ballroom erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. The shareholders looked at each other in total confusion. The conglomerate executives took a step forward, their eyes narrowing as they processed the magnitude of my statement. "Shut your mouth," Genevieve, Preston roared, lunging toward me again. "My father left that specific parcel of land out of the main corporate portfolio 5 years ago." I announced, raising my voice to carry over Preston's desperate shouting. "And yesterday morning, inside the office of Harrison Thorne Preston, and Beatrice legally transferred the sole deed of that exact property directly into my name. They thought it was a worthless dirt farm. Instead, they handed me the absolute leverage to your entire commercial development project." I reached into my emerald gown and pulled out a certified copy of the property deed. I held it up high under the bright stage lights for the entire room to see. "I do not represent the bankrupt logistics company," I told the billionaire buyers, staring them down with absolute authority. "I am the sole owner of the municipal aquifer. My private asset alone is worth $300 million to your development project. That makes my personal net worth double the value of this entire company. My stepbrother is desperately trying to sell you. If you want to build your development, you do not negotiate with Preston. You negotiate with me." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy. The power dynamic in the ballroom completely shattered and rebuilt itself around me in a matter of seconds. The conglomerate executives completely turned their backs on Preston. They looked up at me, their expressions shifting from hostile skepticism to deep, respectful business interest. Beatrice stood frozen near the front of the stage. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She finally realized why I had signed the documents at the law firm with fake tears. She realized she had handed me the very weapon I was now using to publicly execute her son's corporate standing. I stood on the stage, the vintage diamonds resting cool against my skin. I had taken their insults, their theft, and their mockery. I had let them think I was nothing but a glorified calculator. But tonight I was not just settling a family dispute. I was destroying their financial existence in front of the entire city. The billionaire executives did not even spare Preston a second glance. They completely turned their backs on his frantic, sweating face and began walking directly toward the stage where I stood. They were businessmen, and I had just proven that I held the singular key to their multi-billion-dollar development project. The room erupted into a deafening roar of overlapping conversations. Shareholders who had been ready to applaud Preston just minutes ago were now demanding answers, shouting over each other to understand why the company portfolios were suddenly worthless. Preston looked like a man drowning in a stormy sea. His perfectly gelled hair had fallen across his forehead. He was grabbing the sleeves of passing board members, desperately trying to string together a coherent lie to salvage the $200 million deal. But nobody was listening to him anymore. The illusion of his competence had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I watched Beatrice from my vantage point on the elevated stage. The absolute horror that had frozen her face was slowly melting away, replaced by a dark, frantic calculation. She saw the executives approaching me. She saw her son having a public breakdown. She saw the $50 million life insurance payout and her luxurious future slipping right through her manicured fingers. She knew she had lost the financial war. Beatrice caught the eye of Harrison Thorne, the corrupt family lawyer standing near the catering tables. They exchanged a single sharp look. It was a silent, desperate confirmation. It was time to deploy the ultimate contingency plan. Beatrice suddenly pushed her way through the crowded dance floor. She shoved past the wealthy socialites and angry shareholders with aggressive force. As she reached the base of the stage, her entire demeanor shifted. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Her shoulders began to shake violently. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud, piercing sob that cut straight through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. She stumbled up the wooden stairs of the stage, acting as though her legs could barely support her weight. The crowd immediately quieted down, shocked by the sudden display of raw, unfiltered grief from the usually composed matriarch. Beatrice lunged toward the podium. She ripped the microphone from the stand, clutching it to her chest as she turned to face the hundreds of powerful guests. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Do not listen to her," Beatrice cried out into the microphone, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Her words were laced with a perfectly manufactured, heartbreaking tremor. "Please, you cannot do business with this monster. You do not know what she has done." The two conglomerate executives stopped dead in their tracks just a few feet away from the stage. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. "Genevieve did not just inherit that land by accident," Beatrice sobbed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. She knew exactly what that aquifer was worth. She knew it would make her richer than all of us combined. But she could not get her hands on the deed while my beloved husband was still alive. Winston would never have allowed her to dismantle his legacy. Preston stopped his frantic pacing. He looked up at his mother, his panicked breathing slowing down as he realized what she was doing. A sick, triumphant gleam sparked in his eyes. He quickly adjusted his ruined tie and marched up the stairs to stand protectively beside Beatrice, placing a heavy arm around her shaking shoulders. "Tell them Mom," Preston encouraged, loudly playing the role of the devoted son, shielding his grieving mother. "Tell everyone the truth about what happened to Dad." Beatrice let out a ragged wail, leaning her weight against Preston. "Winston did not die of a natural heart attack." She wept into the microphone, casting her gaze across the horrified faces of the shareholders. "We received a private phone call from the medical examiner just this morning. I could not bear to believe it, but the proof is undeniable. My husband was murdered." A loud collective gasp rippled through the elegant crowd. Women covered their mouths in shock. Men muttered in disbelief. Beatrice reached into the bodice of her custom morning dress and pulled out a folded sheaf of official-looking papers. It was the forged toxicology report she had bought from the struck-off black market medical examiner. She unfolded the document and waved it desperately in the air for the crowd and the news cameras to see. "This is the official post-mortem toxicology screen," Beatrice cried out, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. The coroner found massive lethal amounts of a digitalis compound in Winston's bloodstream. He was poisoned. He was slowly, maliciously poisoned in his own home. And Genevieve is the one who did it. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. People began shouting. Security guards moved nervously toward the stage. The conglomerate executives took several large steps backward, putting physical distance between themselves and me. Nobody wants to sign a commercial real estate contract with a woman who is about to be indicted for patricide. She hated her father. Beatrice continued, her voice projecting over the shouting crowd. She was bitter and jealous because she felt abandoned. She bought the poison on the dark web. She laced his drinks so she could trigger the inheritance clause and steal that municipal aquifer for herself. She murdered my husband for a piece of real estate. I stood perfectly still in my emerald gown. I did not yell back. I did not try to snatch the microphone from her hands. I simply watched her perform. It was a brilliant, terrifying trap. She was using the very asset I had just revealed against me, twisting my $300 million land deed into the ultimate motive for cold-blooded murder. She was painting me as a greedy, psychotic killer in front of the city's entire financial elite. Right on cue, a sound began to bleed through the high-arched windows of the downtown hotel. It started as a faint, distant wail, but it grew louder and more piercing with every passing second. Sirens. The wailing sirens echoed down the city streets, bouncing off the skyscrapers as they approached the plaza. Preston had timed his bribe perfectly. The corrupt police captain he had paid off with his last remaining cash reserves was arriving exactly as planned to execute the public arrest. Preston turned to me, his chest puffed out with arrogant victory. He stepped away from Beatrice and walked until he was standing just inches from my face. "You really thought you could come in here and take my empire?" Preston whispered, his voice so low that the microphone could not pick it up. "You thought a fancy dress and a piece of paper made you untouchable. I told you I was going to destroy your life, Genevieve. The police are pulling up to the front doors right now. You are going to leave this ballroom in handcuffs. You are going to rot in a concrete cell for the rest of your miserable life, and I am going to take your aquifer anyway." The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers illuminated the frosted glass of the ballroom windows, casting an eerie, frantic glow over the terrified shareholders. The sirens cut off abruptly as the vehicles parked aggressively on the plaza steps. Heavy, chaotic footsteps echoed from the grand lobby outside. The massive wooden double doors of the ballroom suddenly flew wide open, slamming against the walls with a violent, booming crash. The crowd panicked, parting like the Red Sea as they scrambled to get out of the way. Two uniformed Chicago police officers strode into the magnificent room. They moved with absolute authority, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. The metal handcuffs clipped to their sides jingled sharply with every heavy step they took across the plush carpet. Beatrice let out a loud, theatrical sob of relief into the microphone, acting as though her nightmare was finally over. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks. "There she is," Beatrice cried out to the advancing officers. "That is Genevieve. She is the one who murdered my husband. Please, you have to arrest her." Preston smirked, a cruel, vicious expression that twisted his entire face. He turned toward the officers marching down the center aisle and pointed his finger right at my chest. "Arrest her!" Preston commanded triumphantly, his voice ringing with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he had just won the ultimate war. The two police officers reached the base of the wooden stairs. They stepped up onto the stage, their boots thudding heavily against the floorboards. They stopped just a few feet away from where Preston and I were standing. But the officers did not look at me. They did not reach for their handcuffs. They did not even acknowledge Beatrice waving the forged toxicology report in the air. Instead, the two officers stopped, turned their bodies slightly, and parted straight down the middle. They stepped aside in perfect synchronization, creating a clear, unobstructed path for the person who was walking through the ballroom doors right behind them. The two uniformed police officers did not reach for their handcuffs. They did not even acknowledge Beatrice waving the forged toxicology report in the air. Instead, the officers stopped perfectly in sync, turned their bodies slightly, and parted straight down the middle. They stepped aside, creating a clear, unobstructed path for the person walking through the grand mahogany doors right behind them. The man who walked into the opulent ballroom did not look like a corpse. He did not look like a frail victim who had spent the last week hiding in an abandoned farmhouse hooked up to a medical generator. He looked exactly like the ruthless, brilliant titan of industry who had built this entire logistics empire from absolutely nothing. My father Winston strode into the room. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was brushed back immaculately. His posture was rigid, commanding, and radiating an absolute terrifying fury. The silence that fell over the ballroom was immediate and total. 300 of the city's most powerful politicians, investors, and socialites stopped breathing all at once. Then a collective shuddering gasp rippled through the massive space. People shrank back, pressing themselves against the catered tables, entirely unsure if they were looking at a ghost or a miracle. I looked down at Beatrice. The forged toxicology report slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering uselessly to the floor. The crystal champagne flute she had been holding dropped straight out of her hand. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into hundreds of glittering pieces. She did not even flinch at the sound. Her eyes were stretched so wide they looked like they might tear. All the color, all the arrogant, fabricated grief, completely vanished from her face, leaving behind a chalky, horrified gray. Preston fared even worse. The smug, victorious smirk he had worn just seconds ago melted off his face like wax near an open flame. He stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping on the carpet. His knees literally gave out beneath him. He crashed hard into a velvet dining chair, collapsing into it like a puppet whose strings had just been brutally severed. He stared at his resurrected stepfather, his jaw hanging slack, completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. My father did not look at the police officers. He did not look at the terrified shareholders. He kept his eyes locked entirely on Beatrice as he marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. He climbed the wooden stairs of the stage with steady, purposeful steps. Beatrice was frozen, her hand still hovering in the air where she had been gripping the microphone. Winston walked right up to her. He did not yell. He did not raise a hand. He simply reached out and took the microphone from her rigid, trembling fingers. His quiet, lethal calmness was infinitely more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. "I apologize for missing my own funeral," Winston said, his deep, resonant voice echoing flawlessly across the silent ballroom. "But as you can see, the reports of my death were highly exaggerated and heavily manufactured." He turned his gaze toward the crowd. "My wife just told you all a very compelling story. She told you I was murdered. She was absolutely correct about that specific fact. But she lied about the executioner." Winston did not rush. He detailed the horror of the last 6 months with clinical precision. He explained the Digitalist compound. He described the mornings Beatrice insisted on brewing his coffee to ensure he drank the poison. He credited Clara, the hospice nurse, for noticing the irregular arrhythmias on his medical monitors and quietly substituting his medication. He explained the cardiac suppression drug, the fake death, the bribes paid to the private morgue, and the heavy sandbags currently resting in his burial plot. "I had to let them think they won," Winston announced, his voice slicing through the heavy air. "I had to step into the shadows so I could watch them step into the light and reveal exactly who they are to all of you." He turned to look at Preston, who was physically shrinking into his chair, trying to make himself invisible. "My daughter did not buy poison on the dark web," Winston said coldly. "But someone else in this room did." Winston looked at me and gave a sharp, definitive nod. This was my cue. I reached into my emerald gown and pulled out my secure smartphone. I connected it wirelessly to the ballroom's massive state-of-the-art audiovisual system. Beatrice had spared no expense on the event technology, intending to use it for her grand corporate presentation. Instead, I used it to broadcast her absolute destruction. I hit play on the audio file Clara had managed to record weeks ago from the hallway outside the master suite. The recording crackled slightly before Beatrice's voice filled the room, crisp and undeniable. "The dosage needs to be increased, Preston. He is fighting it off too well. If he does not have a massive cardiac event by the end of the month, the corporate bylaws will require a full board review before you can take over as chief executive." Then Preston's voice echoed through the massive speakers laced with panic and greed. "Just put more in his coffee, Mom. The syndicate gave me a deadline. We need him dead, and we need that $50 million insurance payout before they break my legs. Just do it." I stopped the audio file. The silence that followed was suffocating. Beatrice let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, covering her face with her shaking hands. The high society guests stared at her in absolute revulsion. The local police officers standing at the base of the stage immediately placed their hands on their radios, shifting their entire tactical focus directly onto Beatrice and Preston. Attempted murder is only half of the story, Winston said, handing the microphone to me. Genevieve, show them the rest. I walked to the master projection console at the edge of the stage. With a single decisive keystroke, I bypassed the hotel's presentation software and mirrored my secure forensic terminal directly onto the three massive projector screens hanging above the stage. The screens flared to life, illuminating the dark ballroom with blinding white light. I did not just show a summary. I displayed the real-time raw forensic audit I had compiled from Preston's cloned hard drive. Massive, undeniable graphs and routing protocols flashed across the screens for every shareholder to see. I highlighted the fake maritime freight consulting invoices in bright red. I showed the shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I displayed the dark web cryptocurrency ledgers and the offshore blind trusts, tracking the stolen money step by step. My stepbrother has been acting as your chief executive, I announced, my voice commanding and absolutely steady. But he has not been expanding this logistics company. He has been systematically bleeding it dry. Right behind me is the irrefutable paper trail proving Preston embezzled $40 million in liquid corporate assets over the last 5 months. Angry shouts erupted from the crowd of shareholders. They realized their investments had been completely hollowed out by a fraudulent leader. I clicked to the next slide, bringing up the intercepted syndicate threats and the illegal gambling ledgers. I did not steal this money to invest. I continued speaking over the rising outrage. He stole it to cover catastrophic losses in an illegal international underground betting syndicate. The company operational accounts are completely empty. The commercial acquisition he has been pitching to you tonight was nothing but a desperate, fraudulent fire sale designed to pay off a ruthless cartel before they executed him. I turned my attention specifically to the two lead executives from the commercial conglomerate. They were standing perfectly still near the front row, their faces carved from stone as they processed the massive financial crime displayed on the screens above my head. They had almost wired $200 million to a man drowning in cartel debt. They had almost bought a company completely destroyed by embezzlement. The lead executive did not say a single word. He calmly reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out the thick, legally binding acquisition contract they had planned to sign that very evening. He held it up high in the air so Preston could see it clearly. Then, with deliberate, furious precision, the billionaire tore the contract cleanly in half. He stacked the pieces and tore them in half again, letting the shredded paper flutter down onto the plush carpet of the ballroom floor. The second executive gave a sharp, disgusted shake of his head. Without a backward glance, the two immensely powerful businessmen turned around and walked straight out of the ballroom. Their private security details followed closely behind, parting the crowd and leaving the grand doors swinging in their wake. The $200 million deal was officially permanently dead. Preston's last hope of survival had just walked out the door. Preston let out a guttural, panicked sob from his chair. He clutched his hair, rocking back and forth as the reality of his situation crushed the last breath from his lungs. He had no money. The cartel was actively hunting him. The conglomerate was gone forever. And the police were standing right in front of him. Beatrice looked like a hollowed-out shell. The glamorous, untouchable matriarch was completely gone. In her place sat a terrified criminal who had just watched her entire fraudulent empire burn to ashes in under 5 minutes. Preston watched the two police officers march up the wooden stairs of the stage. His panicked, ragged breathing hitched in his chest as he desperately pointed his shaking finger at me. He was completely out of his mind, with terror clinging to his original plan like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. "What are you waiting for?" Preston screamed at the officers, his voice cracking loudly. "Arrest her! She bought the poison. She murdered him. I have the audio confession on my phone. Grab her right now." The lead officer did not even glance in my direction. He stepped right past me, his heavy boots thudding against the stage floor, and walked directly up to Preston. I recognized the broad shoulders, the tight jaw, and the tired, uncompromising eyes immediately. It was Detective Carter, the same man who had interrogated me in the windowless room at the downtown precinct just 24 hours ago. His partner, Detective Ramirez, stepped up onto the stage right behind him. Preston finally realized the officers were not looking at me. They were looking at him. Detective Carter reached to his utility belt and unclipped his heavy metal handcuffs. The sharp metallic rattling sound echoed clearly into the live microphone still resting on the podium. Preston Carter set his voice a low, authoritative rumble that carried absolute finality. "You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Put your hands behind your back." Preston's eyes bulged out of his head. He looked at Carter, then at me, then at my father standing tall and furious on the edge of the stage. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine and tried to scramble backward, but there was nowhere left to go. Carter grabbed Preston by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed his wrists into the steel cuffs. The metal clicked shut with a brutal, satisfying finality. No, Preston sobbed, his knees buckling completely. He hung dead weight in Carter's grip, crying like a frightened child. "Dad, please, tell them to stop. I am your son. I did not mean to do it. The cartel was going to kill me. You have to help me." Winston looked down at the boy he had raised for 15 years. There was absolutely no warmth left in my father's eyes. "You stopped being my son the day you put poison in my cup," Winston said coldly. "Enjoy federal prison, Preston. I hear they do not take corporate credit cards at the commissary." While Carter secured Preston, Detective Ramirez walked straight toward Beatrice. The glamorous matriarch was still frozen near the edge of the stage, her custom black silk morning dress looking entirely ridiculous now that her murdered husband was standing 10 feet away from her. As Ramirez reached for her arm, the shock finally wore off. Beatrice snapped out of her paralysis and completely lost her mind. She slapped the detective's hand away, taking a wild, aggressive swing at his face. "Do not touch me!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice turning into a harsh, ugly screech. "I am a respectable woman. I am the lady of this estate. You have absolutely no right to put your filthy hands on me. I want my lawyer. Where is Harrison?" Ramirez did not hesitate. He grabbed Beatrice by both arms, ignoring her frantic kicking and screaming, and forced her hands behind her back. He locked the handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Beatrice Hayes Ramirez announced loudly over her chaotic screaming. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, massive insurance fraud, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, though I highly suggest you start using it immediately." At the mention of the lawyer, I turned my attention toward the back of the grand ballroom. Harrison Thorne, the corrupt family attorney who had orchestrated the forged will and the fake toxicology report, was currently trying to slip out through the service exit near the catering kitchen. He had abandoned his expensive briefcase and was practically sprinting toward the door. He did not make it far. Two uniformed officers were waiting right on the other side of the swinging doors. They grabbed Thorne by the lapels of his expensive suit, shoved him against the patterned wallpaper of the corridor, and handcuffed him immediately. The architect of their legal fraud was going down right alongside them. Beatrice was thrashing violently against Detective Ramirez's grip. Her perfectly styled blonde hair had fallen across her face in a chaotic, sweaty mess. The wealthy shareholders and billionaire executives watched in absolute mesmerized disgust as the woman who had ruled their social circles was reduced to a screaming criminal. "I deserve everything I took!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice completely hoarse. "I built this family. I suffered through this miserable marriage. I earned that $50 million. I earned my luxurious lifestyle. You cannot take my money away from me. I am a wealthy woman." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I walked directly into her path, forcing Detective Ramirez to pause for just a moment before he dragged her down the stairs of the stage. I looked at the woman who had spent 15 years trying to erase me from my own family. I looked at the woman who had poisoned my father and tried to frame me for his murder just to fund her boundless greed. I reached into my small emerald clutch. My fingers brushed against a piece of folded leather. I pulled out the itemized billfold from the Oakwood Country Club, the exact same leather folder Beatrice had publicly shoved into my chest just a few days ago at the funeral reception. I held the billfold up, letting the bright stage lights illuminate the elegant leather. I popped it open and pulled out the crisp printed invoice for my father's $45,000 fake funeral. I stepped right into Beatrice's personal space. Her frantic screaming stopped as she stared at the piece of paper in my hand. "You wanted me to pay for the casket, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "You told me it was the least I could do to show gratitude for my upbringing." I neatly folded the invoice and tucked it directly into the front pocket of her expensive black silk morning dress. I leaned in close, making sure she could hear every single syllable of my final victory. "You will need to figure out how to pay this from Commissary Beatrice," I whispered sharply. "Because I just called my bank. I am stopping the payment on my black card. The country club is going to send this debt to a collection agency, and they are going to attach it directly to your ruined name." Beatrice let out a sound of pure helpless rage. It was a strangled, suffocating noise of a predator realizing it was permanently trapped in a cage. Detective Ramirez pulled her forward, dragging her roughly down the wooden stairs of the stage. Preston was hauled away right behind her, still sobbing and begging for a lawyer who was currently being arrested in the kitchen. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind them. Their frantic screaming was completely cut off, leaving the grand space sitting in a stunned, ringing silence. The toxic infection that had plagued my family for 15 years was finally completely gone. Winston let out a long, heavy exhale. He rolled his shoulders back, adjusting his charcoal suit, and stepped up to the podium. He picked up the microphone. He looked out at the sea of shareholders, investors, and remaining board members. The room was absolutely captivated. They had just witnessed the greatest corporate takedown in the history of the city. "Ladies and gentlemen," Winston said, his deep voice projecting absolute stability and power, "I apologize for the dramatic interruption to your evening. Rest assured, the individuals responsible for the financial instability of this corporation have been permanently removed. The embezzled funds will be recovered through federal asset forfeiture, and our operations will resume immediately." He turned his head and looked directly at me. The pride shining in my father's eyes was so bright, it physically warmed my chest. However, Winston continued, turning back to the crowd. "I have spent the last week gaining some much-needed perspective on the future of my legacy. It is time for a new era of leadership. It is time for someone with the vision, the intelligence, and the absolute ruthlessness required to protect this empire." Winston gestured for me to join him at the podium. I walked over, my emerald gown sweeping elegantly across the stage. "Effective immediately," Winston announced, raising his voice so it echoed clearly in every corner of the room. "I am stepping down as the head of this corporation. I officially name my daughter Genevieve as the new chief executive officer of the logistics empire. She is the sole owner of the municipal aquifer, she is a brilliant forensic auditor, and she is the only person I trust to lead this company into the next century." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the two billionaire executives from the commercial conglomerate, who had returned to the ballroom after the police arrived, began to clap. Their applause was slow and highly respectful. Within seconds, the entire board of directors joined in. The shareholders followed. The ballroom erupted into a massive, thunderous standing ovation. I looked out at the cheering crowd, then up at my father. He smiled and pulled me into a fierce, protective embrace. We had won. 2 weeks later, the dust had completely settled. Beatrice and Preston were sitting in a federal holding facility without bail, awaiting a trial. They were guaranteed to lose. The corrupt medical examiner and the family lawyer had both taken plea deals, providing the district attorney with enough evidence to put my stepfamily away for decades. The $40 million Preston stole was slowly being untangled from the offshore accounts by federal authorities, and the cartel had shifted their violent attention far away from Chicago. I stood on the grand stone balcony of the family mansion. The evening air was crisp and clean. The sprawling estate was quiet, completely scrubbed of Beatrice's toxic, arrogant presence. The oppressive energy that used to suffocate these halls was entirely gone. It finally felt like a home again. I heard the heavy glass balcony doors slide open behind me. Winston stepped out into the cool night air. His color was completely back to normal, the poison entirely flushed from his system. He walked over to the stone railing and handed me a heavy crystal glass filled with aged scotch. He clinked his glass against mine. The crystal rang with a clear, beautiful sound. To new beginnings, Winston said softly, taking a slow sip of his drink. I looked out over the manicured lawns of the estate, then beyond the gates toward the glowing lights of the Chicago skyline. I had spent my entire life trying to stay invisible, letting greedy, cruel people dictate my worth. But I was never a glorified calculator. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. To new beginnings, Dad, I replied, raising my glass to the bright, unlimited future waiting for us. We drank our scotch in the peaceful silence, looking out at the massive empire we had reclaimed, knowing nobody would ever dare underestimate us again.